Can we start?
Shall we?
Yeah, it is 10 o'clock.
Yes, sir.
9:50, very specific.
रहिए जो नहीं रहा है फिर भी
Good morning, everybody. On behalf of Indian Psychiatric Society, Psychotherapy Subcommittee, I welcome you all for the interesting session on psychotherapy in children. Dr. Parag Shah, the professor and head of Department of Psychiatry, Surat Municipal Institute of Medical Sciences, Medical Education and Research from Surat, and zonal representative from West Zone of Indian Psychiatric Society on IPS is chairing this session today. Mr. Parag, I hand over the proceedings of this program to you. Please take over, sir.
Thank you, sir. On behalf of the Psychotherapy Subcommittee, Indian Psychiatric Society, and my team, we have Dr. Vivek Kirpakar as the chairperson. We have Dr. Sona Kakkar as the co-chairperson of the subcommittee. We have Dr. Prathma Chaudhary as the convener, Dr. R. Raghuram as the advisor, and myself, Dr. Parag Shah, as the EC coordinator. On behalf of the subcommittee, we all extend a warm welcome to each and everyone present in the room for today's session on a lovely topic with a lovely speaker. One more time, the psychotherapy subcommittee is here with a very interesting discussion. Today we have with us Dr. Bhushan Shukla, and he's going to share his experiences and his wisdom on the topic of psychotherapy with children. As we know that we have been talking about various different aspects of psychotherapy in the last many months. And this is one of the important area that would help us to develop some more perspective into the psychotherapy practice in psychiatry, especially how it differs when we are dealing with children. I extend a warm welcome to the Indian Psychiatric Society committee. We have with us Dr. TSS Rao, sir, as Honorary General Secretary of IPS. Good morning, sir. Welcome, sir. We have the blessings of Dr. Gautam Saha, sir, Dr. Anand Raju, sir, Dr. KK Mishra, sir, and Dr. Om Prakash Singh, sir. So before I invite the speaker for today to deliver his presentation, I take this privilege to introduce him. We have with us today Dr. Bhushan Shukla, practicing child and adolescent psychiatrist at Pune. He's trained in psychiatry in India and in UK and has done his MD, DNB and MRC Psych. He has received extensive psychotherapy supervision in various therapies like behavioral therapy, CBT, play therapy, person-centered therapy, EMDR, systemic family therapy, as well as medical hypnosis. He has been working in various different areas of his interest, and one of the prominent one is working in the field of child sexual abuse. And he has been running a very famous program on No, Go, Tell. That's the theme and the logo. And we have him featured in the famous Satyamev Jayate program telecasted by Amir Khan. And his same training program of No, Go, Tell has been adopted by multiple non-government and government organizations with regards to spreading awareness for child sexual abuse. He has been working as a child psychiatrist with various schools, colleges, family courts, and juvenile justice systems, and has been conducting a lot of parenting workshops apart from his busy practice as child psychiatrist at Pune. I extend a very warm welcome, sir. We are so happy and excited to hear you. The session is all yours. You can begin, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Paraksha. That's a lovely introduction and makes me feel really good about myself. So it's a nice mood to start on a lot of positive enforcement. Good morning, everyone. Let me clear.
Can we unmute the speaker, please?
Hello. Yeah. Yeah. Can everybody hear me now?
Yes,
Now,
we
yes.
can.
Brilliant. Okay, fine. So I'll start again. That's a good start to speech with a lot of positive enforcement by Chairperson Dr. Shah. Uh, as with any psychotherapy, I would like to uh, put here my limitations first, or as we call it, the boundaries of psychotherapy first. I am a full-time private practitioner. Once a week, I work at a medical college nearby, uh, running their child psychiatry OPD and training postgraduate students. But 85% of my work is a full-time private practice, where I have support of a very well-trained child psychologist and other team members as well. In today's presentation, I'm going to make an assumption that most of us are standalone practitioners like me, who may have a support of child psychologists with them or may not have that at all. When we get given guidelines on treatment, these guidelines are typically more suited for a very well-equipped, well-funded, and well-manned medical college department or central government departments, where a lot of highly trained people are available to support us when we are running a child psychiatry department. I'm not making that assumption today at all. So my entire presentation is going to be focused for a stand-alone psychiatrist or a psychiatrist with little support, working mainly in urban areas of India. Because again, rural work is going to present some very difficult challenges that we all are aware of. So if you find this transgressing from the textbook description of therapy or current guidelines, it is a deliberate sidestep to accommodate our working conditions. And this is going to be the plan of the talk. We are going to talk about why therapy, then what therapy is appropriate, how to go about it, and what to do or why therapy fails. Because everything can fail. So what do we do, or when do we know that therapy has failed? This is my broad plan for today. As they say in pediatrics, when pediatrics was introduced as a different branch in medicine, they said that children are not little adults. So it is important to have separate physicians for children who understand how children are. And now you have separate neonatologists as well, and pediatricians trying to differentiate themselves for 9 to 19 clinics, where they clearly identify that different developmental stages bring about different physiology. So they need to be catered by doctors who are specifically trained to do that. One doctor cannot look after the entire spectrum. Similar thing is happening in child psychiatry as well. We have identified that children are not exactly little adults. So what we do for adults is many times not at all applicable to children. And now in developed countries, we have infant psychiatry as well, 0 to 1 or 0 to 3 years of age. So exactly what makes children different from adults is important to remember, because all of us are trained as adult psychiatrists and majority of our practice is adult psychiatry. There are probably less than 100 psychiatrists with me who have severed our connection with adults and have happily gone back to working only with children and back to our childhood. So exactly how does this different, how are they different from adults? First is that you are looking at an evolving brain. First question that I ask as a child psychiatrist when any question is put to me is, how old is the child? Because that is one of the most important questions in child psychiatry. At different developmental ages, what is normal and what is not normal changes completely. What is perfectly fine for a 4-year-old may be grossly abnormal for a 16-year-old and absolutely intolerable for a 20-year-old. So it is important to remember that though you are dealing with child psychiatry, you are actually dealing with different brains, or the same child, if you're seeing them for 2 or 3 years, you are actually looking at a different person altogether. This is something important to remember because many times we carry the first impressions of the patient and the family in our head and forget that they are evolving, they are changing. Most of the school teachers know this, that when children come back from vacation or when children graduate to the next year, they actually enter a different phase of their life. For example, when you see a 3-year-old child and a 4 or 5-year-old child, what you have to realize is that they have changed by almost 50%. They have had 50% more time for development. So you are practically looking at a new person there. This is something that is important to remember. So this evolving brain, this growing brain, not only has its own vulnerabilities in form of not very well developed neuronal connections, not very well developed prefrontal lobe control, not very well developed executive functions, what in olden days could have been called as the ego boundary, or in analytical terms, which is still called ego boundary, where the inhibitory controls are not very well developed. So everything can affect them in a much more severe way. But at the same time, this brain has enormous amount of plasticity, which is not available to us in adult psychiatry and definitely not in senior citizens. So we have our own difficulties, but we have our own advantages while working with children as well. Another thing that impacts all children is that they have almost no autonomy about their life. From being completely dependent on their mother at the time of birth when the cord is cut, to trying to run the house on their own will as an adolescent, children progress very rapidly within 14 to 15 years. But large number of important life decisions are made for them by other people with whom they may not agree at all. The most important decision of a child's life, of which school they are going to go to, where they are going to spend almost 50% of their time, is made by other people for them. Their parents decide where they are going to live. That alters their friendships, that alters their living conditions. Their parents many times change jobs, so children have to move. So the closest relationships that they have developed with teachers and friends snap within minutes and they move on. In many urban centers like Mumbai, Pune, Bangalore, Hyderabad, even in Delhi, there is a 20% turnover of children and teachers every year. No adult faces this level of turmoil in their life. So children have no autonomy on their environment and growing environment. They are open to all sorts of influences, not only from family, but from other people as well. Many times when I treat children with eating disorders, I see that their role models are either in Thailand or in Norway or in America, and these semi-teenagers are influencing their life more than what is happening in their immediate family. And this is a huge vulnerability. You and I don't have that. We may look at Elon Musk and feel a little bit bad that, oh, maybe I should have taken engineering instead of medical. But that doesn't affect our life a great deal as a 14-year-old who's following a Thai transgender model for her dietary prescriptions. They can't buy their own treatment. And this becomes an absolute defining factor in anything that you do in child psychiatry. They have no control on their own money. They do not decide when they are unwell. They do not decide what parameters make them unwell. They do not decide that they are well now. It is entirely taken over by other people. So though you are primarily trying to treat a child, you are also catering to the paymaster whose wishes and whims and fancies are going to decide whether you will be able to continue working with this child or this child is just going to disappear. This is one of the biggest parts. This is where the right to refuse a client, which is available for adult psychiatrists, is not available to child psychiatrists, because you may hate the parent. They may be absolutely nasty and troubling you in various ways. Still, you continue to work with them and do not discharge them from your caseload, because you know that your role is to help the child. And if tolerating those parents is so difficult for you as an independent professional adult, how terrible it must be for that child to grow up in that environment. So we continue to sometimes buffer that abuse and absorb some of it, like Shankar drinking halahal from Samudra Manthan, to continue working with the child. That is our real focus. So this should never be, this should always be the bullseye when we are looking at treatment. This is where eyes have to be focused. And another difficult part for children is that they don't even know what can be helped in their present life condition and how. So a lot of part of child therapy is actually educating the child, making them aware, and giving them back control of their life bit by bit, so that process can remain and continue for all their life. So these are the basics in which child psychotherapy differs very significantly from any adult work that you are ever trained for or ever do. So we of course know, all of us, that first line of treatment for almost every diagnosis in child psychiatry is psychotherapy. I'm not talking about neurodevelopmental disorders, but other emotional, behavioral, and mood disorders and anxiety disorders here. Even in cases of psychosis, psychotherapy is the first adjunct that you use along with medication to make your therapy more effective. So any child psychotherapy or any treatment in children must have a significant component of psychotherapy. Without that, this treatment is going to fail. All of us have training or some or the other form of training during our MD for psychotherapy. Most of us are enthusiastic. We actually belong to the group where we joined psychiatry because of fascination of mind. Our first love is always psychotherapy. Medicines actually come in much later, right? So that is why we are all psychiatrists, because we like to work with mind to mind. So all of us have some form of psychotherapy training during our post-graduation. Almost all of us take additional training after we have finished our MD, because we know that what we have got in our MD may not be enough. We need more treatment. Some people who are crazy about psychotherapy like me continue to seek various supervisions and try to see how different psychotherapies work and can we use them in our practice. So here is the synthesis that I'm presenting for you. So when choosing a therapy, you would be seriously limited by your own training. This is not something that happens to people who write treatment guidelines. They're either in Western countries or some of the best institutes in India, where they actually have huge team with people who have specific skills in various therapies. You and I may not have that advantage. We may have stitched our own psychotherapy training by whatever training modules that were available. So without feeling bogged down by lack of formal psychotherapy training in any one discipline, we have to remember is that research clearly tells us that there are certain core components of effective therapy with children. As long as you incorporate these three components in your therapy plan, irrespective of what you are going to use as your preferred therapy model, you will be successful. It is really important to remember this, that irrespective of your therapy model, as long as you include these core components, the therapy is going to be successful. So do not shy away from offering therapy to children who, if you feel that you do not have adequate training in, say, CBT or systemic family therapy, it is helpful, but absolutely not mandatory. So the first component is that we have to offer help with what is going on in the child's mind. We have to remember that particularly young children cannot even differentiate between their dreams and their reality. When we talked about ego boundaries, when we talked about an immature brain, this is what we are talking about. That most of the children live a split life between their head and their body. And particularly the children that we see, children who typically come to therapy with internalizing disorders, spend their entire life in their mind. So we must help the child with what is going on in their mind. I'll come to details of this part later on. Second is we have to help them modify behaviors. Entire child psychiatry revolves in behavior, around behavior modification, because no matter what is the axis 1, axis 2 diagnosis for you and me, parents and other people are only going to notice behavior. The internal world of the child is largely unavailable to all the adults around them, because children do not trust and speak that much. Children do not get opportunity to speak that much about their own inner world, and they may not have the cognitive and the language ability to express it clearly to adults. So almost everything that parents tell you is about child's behavior. If you analyze the chief complaints and the history that parents give you, it is almost 99% behavior and barely 1% about emotions and thoughts. So the internal world of the child is what you work with, but you have to help them modify their behaviors in a very specific way. Otherwise, not only they will not be helped, but their improvement, their change will not be perceived by other significant adults in their life, and they may simply taken off therapy because therapy is not working according to the adult who makes the payment. So behavioral modification is extremely important. And the third component is modifying environment. Primarily, this is about family, but in large section, this involves school as well. We are going to talk about details of all these three components now. So just to reiterate, helping the child with what is going on in their mind is one component. Helping them modify their behavior, so external manifestations of their internal world and their struggles is second component. And helping modify the family school environment is the third. As long as you think and make provisions for all these three components in psychotherapy for a child, it does not matter which school of psychotherapy you follow. This remains the bedrock of successful therapy for children. So let us start with the first component, managing mind. Again, I'm going to be therapy model agnostic here. So the most research and the most evidence base is obviously offered for CBT, but DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, has made a big impact, particularly with self-harm. So anybody who's working with adolescents knows that self-harm is increasing in a very rapid way in urban India and even in rural India. When I left for my child psychiatry training to UK in 2004, I had seen only 2 cases of anorexia nervosa, 1 case of child suicide, and probably in 2-digit cases of children who had harmed themselves either by overdose or by cutting. When I came back in 2008, it was as if I landed in a different world altogether. Now I see self-harm every day. I meet children who are highly suicidal every week, and I see anorexia nervosa as full-blown cases, literally 1 every month. At least 2 or 3 times in a year, I need ICU admissions for these children to refeed them. This is how much our world has changed. So what really helps is dialectical behavior therapy here. Fortunately, Marsha Linehan's books are absolutely wonderful tool. Even if formal training is not available, reading these books, combining it with your therapy experience and using those techniques in our practice is perfectly usable strategy, even in India without a formal training available to you. OCD is almost entirely taken care of by exposure and response prevention. All phobias and most of the anxieties respond beautifully well to systematic desensitization. My favorite, though, is behavior therapy. Because as I said, behavior is one of the most modifiable component, and helping the child modify their behavior gives them a sense of control. Because in most of the child cases, we see that children have this huge sense of loss of control over their thoughts, over their body, and definitely over other people's reactions. So one component that is definitely there, as they say in meditation, the only thing that will help you control your mind is your breath. In the same way, because breath is largely behavioral and partly autonomic, so you have dual control on that. It is same for behavior in child psychiatry. You have partly it is driven by your thoughts and emotions and other people, but largely it is driven by you. So you can control the behavior. My favorite treatment strategy is behavior therapy because it is simple, it is elegant to do, and gives you the most effective behavioral change in least possible amount of time. The most important component of managing mind is modification of negative cognitions. No matter which therapy process you use, whether your training is in CBT, whether it is in REBT, whether you are a pure behavior therapist, or you are a DBT therapist, or you focus on person-centered work or play therapy, whatever that is your choice of therapy, it has to help the child modify negative cognitions. Negative cognitions, as described by Aaron Beck and Judith Beck, simple components, teasing them down to the core thoughts is something that really helps. Most children need a little bit of training to actually track their thoughts. Because as our education goes, as our languages go, the focus is totally on behavior. So helping a child to move down from behavior to thoughts and being able to differentiate their thoughts and emotions is something that is really at the core of therapy. One of the simplest techniques that I have used and which a lot of children find useful is that to differentiate emotion and thought, if you can describe it in a single word, then it is most likely to be an emotion. If you need multiple words or sentences to describe it, then it is most likely a thought. And if there are lots of verbs in it, then you are describing an action. We are talking about behavior. So one of the simplest rubric that a child can use to write a diary, as most of the therapies would require. So this is something that really works, that if you can describe it, if you can describe your feeling or what is going on in your mind in a single word, you're talking about an emotion. If you need multiple words and sentences, then you're talking about thoughts. And if you're using a lot of verbs and describing actions, then you're talking about behavior. This is something that works with most of the children. And this basic thing can help you work with children in therapy. Most of the therapists working in India really struggle at this stage because they feel that the model that they have been trained in does not work with Indian conditions, that does not work with Indian population. So giving Indian population a hook to identify specific therapy components that we require can really make this therapy possible for you. So irrespective whether you are using CBT, DBT, ERP, or systematic desensitization, the first component is always helping the child modify their negative cognitions. And that is half the therapy. Second half of the therapy comes from managing behavior. So what are we doing here? So first part is behavior modification, where the child can identify specific changes in behavior and execute them. Being able to control your body is important for all of us, but being able to control your reaction to the world around you, and as it is said in a very cliched way, moving from reactive mode to responsive mode gives you a huge sense of achievement in your life, which children are really looking for. So behavior modification is what we work on. I typically divide my sessions into 3 parts. First part is about managing the mind, which is almost half of the session. Second half is about managing the behavior. And last 5 minutes, I reserve for medication management. As a standalone psychiatrist, I have to do all 3 components, and medicines are typically part of treatment because very severe cases do get referred on to me. So there is no escaping medicines, but all these 3 components must be addressed in a single therapy session that lasts from 30 minutes to 45 minutes, depending on the child's problem and your clinical situation. So this is another part to remember when we are managing behavior. Stopping an ongoing behavior is much easier than starting a new healthy behavior. When a lot of parents come to you, they talk about a specific desire of how their child should behave. You know, as we always jokingly say, parents have very simple expectations from children. A child should get up early in the morning, wish everybody, brush their teeth, do some exercise, eat that 3000 calories of very carefully made breakfast by their mother, get ready, go to school or sit in front of the computer for their school now, follow entire school very diligently, then finish all the homework as soon as the school is over, finish that lunch, finish that afternoon snack, go out, play with the friends that are chosen by their parents for them, come back home in the evening, immediately wash their hands and feet, change their clothes, sit down with family, tell the mother and the father everything that has happened through the day, eat dinner, do some homework, pray to God, and go to sleep. What is so difficult? These are such simple expectations by parents, isn't it? But what it means is that it requires you to start an entirely different behavior and continue it even if you don't like it. As a psychiatrist, as somebody who works with children, I always think that we have to produce results. That pressure is always there. We have to produce results for the child's sake. We have to produce results for the family's sake. And stopping harmful behavior is one of the easiest things to do. Stopping a behavior can be done by child themselves or by arranging the environment to stop those specific behaviors, block harmful behaviors. Giving an entirely new habit to the child is an uphill task. So at least in the initial phase of therapy, when you are still building rapport, when you still do not have full confidence of the child, focusing on stopping harmful behavior gives you much better dividends than aiming for starting an entirely different coping behavior. So the way we talked about single word, multiple sentences and actions in the mind part, stop behavior is the crux of managing behavior. And how do we do that? We discuss this in the therapy. We practice this in therapy session, give them specific follow-up instructions to do that at home, and we practice it again in the session. Now, this is one part of behavior therapy which is missed by almost majority of therapists. Behavior therapy is all about action. If you have spent your entire session, behavior therapy session, sitting in a chair and the child sitting in another chair in front of you, it is not behavior therapy. A simple way to know whether you are doing behavior therapy or not, because it involves getting up from your chair, the child doing role plays, you teaching them specific things, even right from body movement and eye movements, everything is taught in that session. Unless you and the child are practicing behaviors, unless you are practicing relaxation techniques, unless you are talking about sentences that they are going to rehearse, what they are going to say, how the ready-made sentences and the sayings are being given to them, how ready-made behaviors are being given to them, how they are going to practice it in the clinic and how they are going to use it outside. Unless all this is being enacted in your therapy room, you are not doing behavior therapy. A typical behavior therapy session should look like what we call as in Marathi, natak basavna jala म्हणतात. You know, these are the takes and the retakes that you do before the final shot. It is action phase. That is how it should look. Your therapy room should be the stage where the child is practicing all these things. Only then behavior therapy is happening. And most important, keep it extremely simple. It is very easy to sit in that chair and give complex behaviors to the child. It is extremely difficult to change that in real practice. So keep it simple. Give them very, very tiny steps. Many times, if you're doing pure behavior therapy, the sessions last only for 10 to 15 minutes, not more than that. Charge them less, see them more frequently, and do these tiny steps one at a time. Why? Because a tiny step is easily doable. Child finds confidence. They feel success. Aim for early success in therapy. When you can give confidence to the child that here is a thing that I had given to you as homework. You did it really well, and that is absolutely brilliant. Now let's take the next step. So keeping it simple, doing it in small steps is absolutely the crux of behavior management. How do we manage the environment? The family, the big Indian family. Like how you see these mafia families in Hollywood movies, I think we can very well do certain movies like that with Indian family. Family is most important. Whatever your take in family therapy, you may be using REBT model, you may be using cognitive therapy model, or you may have training in systemic family therapy. What really matters there is that you have to show empathy and feel that empathy for family members, particularly decision makers. Because we all take up child cases because we have this warm feeling and desire to help children. Many times we end up seeing family as the real villains in child's life. But we have to remember, these villains are paying your bills, and these are the villains who are actually taking responsibility for everything that the child does. Whatever our grouses against them, there has to be equal empathy for the family as we show for our child patients. Because unless they perceive your empathy, unless they perceive that you can actually understand their difficulties and you feel for them, they are not going to cooperate for you. We all are going to ask them to do things to help the child which are completely out of their training, their experience, their culture, and many times completely against what everyone else is advising them. And the only way to get it done from parents is to show absolute empathy with them. Parents need very specific instructions. Do not underestimate the power of miscommunication in therapy. If you have a tendency to speak a lot, to advise a lot, you should actually write down instructions on a piece of paper and give it to them. Most of the parents that walk out of my clinic walk away with a behavioral and a thought and a talk prescription. I actually write it down like prescription and give it to them. It makes it really easy for them to remember and do things. What to say, do not get angry on the child, is a bad advice. Look at the child, make eye contact, make sure that your face is soft, make sure that your voice is more soft and warm. Hold the child close to you. These are very specific instructions. Just do not get angry at the child and do not hit the child is not enough. They need to be given an alternative behavior, alternative talk, alternative body language, and alternative emotion as well as a prescription. This is part of doing therapy for the child. And what are the things that we aim for when we are managing environment? Is de-escalation. That is the first thing. Most of the parents coming to us will talk about repetitive crisis in the family, repetitive meltdowns, either by the child, by the parent, by one of the siblings or the grandparents. So teaching them specific de-escalation techniques in the family is really important. Teaching them containing child's emotion instead of reacting to child's behavior, being able to identify child's emotions, empathetically responding, reflecting that emotion to the child, and reflecting to child's emotion instead of reflecting to child's behavior or responding to child's behavior is something that comes in containment. Most of the parents will happily do that once you ask them to do it. Because it is strange that most of the parents actually need your permission to go back to loving their child the way they was. Because they have so much burden of getting appropriate behavioral performance from the child that they actually get very angry and admonish the child again and again and throw parent tantrums. When you allow them to be the empathic, loving parents that they originally are, they actually feel relieved. They feel deburdened from that burden of performing as a parent. And they start following what you are telling them. Encouraging coping behavior in the child can be done through parents. Many times, the behavioral prescription for parent and the child is quite similar. It is directed towards extracting a very specific behavior, helping behavior from the child. And one of the parents who is always enrolled as a co-therapist can do that for you. So when we are working with family, the instructions have to be very, very specific. They may sound absolutely pedantic, but that is what you need to do. Sometimes you even have to tell the parent that when you get angry with the child, please stand on their right-hand side or left-hand side. It may look like a very simple instruction or very irrelevant instruction, but putting your dominant hand around the child and holding the child close to you is the most rational reaction for all the parents. So standing on that side of the child when things start deteriorating may appear as extremely simple instruction, but this could be the first step of de-escalation of a crisis. So be that specific when you're instructing the parent. Sometimes I have also asked the moms to bring their dinner plates and their serving bowls and serving spoons to the clinic to show them how much they should be serving the child. Fortunately, with mobile phones and cameras, it becomes very easy to do these things in family. I have sometimes encouraged them to use videos of exactly how the behavior is, giving the video phone in the youngest child in the family, in youngest child's hand in the family, and asking them to actually video record what is happening there during crisis, and then discussing that in the family session really helps. But it has to be really concrete and very, very specific. The classic systemic therapy, I doubt if it happens anywhere in India, if it is even possible in our situations. But using those techniques to modify behavior and communication is really welcomed by all our families. And the last and the most important component of child therapy is stepping out of the clinic. Our willingness to get up from the chair for behavior therapy and step out of our clinic and do work outside is something that a lot of children need. What all does it require? It requires occasional visit to the school. Now it is not happening in COVID time, but this will be over soon. Children will be back in their schools. This is what we are going to need. The way we talk to parents, we need to give very clear behavioral targets and behavior instructions to teachers. Many times schools are happy, children are happy to take one other child or a friend as a therapy buddy in school. Their significant friend, with that child's parents' permission, can actually help the child modify behavior, can de-escalate situations for the child. So getting a therapy buddy in school is one of the best things that you can ever do for the child. Many times after the visit, I write a detailed letter or email to the principal of the school, CCing in the teacher, parents, and even the child with very, very specific behavioral instructions like a prescription. Copiously praising the school for their role, their willingness to help, going out of the way, etc., etc. All principals love such praising words from a professional, particularly a psychiatrist like you and me. So it is important to write that letter to them and follow it up on a weekly or a fortnightly basis as per the plan so that they feel supported. Typically, children will see schools and parents as villains. Our job is to make them allies of the children that we are trying to treat. Doing desensitization work and ERP in the home of the child or at the scene is something really important. Stepping out of the clinic, doing home visits, particularly children who have severe OCD, going to their homes and doing ERP sessions at home is hugely helpful. After 1 or 2 home visits, you may be able to continue the work on a video session once you know the layout of the house and how things are. But it is important to actually make that home visit at least once and help the child right there and then. This gives you massive brownie points in eyes of the family, and the child starts trusting you. Many times, in cases of social difficulties or anxieties, it is important to visit that mall, that street, that restaurant with the child and actually doing therapy there. Children absolutely love it. Children will never forget a doctor who actually steps out on the street with them as their friend and helps them deal with the situation that is absolutely undealable for them. So if you are doing behavior therapy, if you are doing desensitizations, it is excellent idea to step out of your clinic and actually do it in real life. Most parents are more than happy to pay the extra money that this takes because no one else offers this. So this is how the 4 components of child therapy work, irrespective of what is your therapy training. We also must talk about what is waste of time. Particularly in today's world, when we have a lot of untrained people, unqualified people, and everybody stepping in and trying to help the child, we must know what is a total waste of time. Generic counseling is total bullshit. And I'm being very honest, transparent, and forthright here. Just sitting across the table from a child, using your listening and communication skills, and saying ha ha, hoo to everything that the child says is not therapy. This doesn't help the child. Child will be more than happy to attend such generic counseling sessions by whoever offers them because they always derive a secondary benefit of being a patient and being in therapy. But we as trained psychiatrists, as people of science who work with evidence and are answerable to law, the only professional in the entire medical system who is answerable to law at present are we medical doctors and psychiatrists. So this kind of generic counseling is total waste of child's time and your time. Philosophizing is an absolute no-no. We have to really check our feelings and not get into philosophizing mode with parents, with school, and definitely not with the child. It is not helpful at all. Motivational talks are great for YouTube. They are great to get likes. They're absolutely fantastic when you do that in your local Rotary Club, Lions Club, parents group, and whatnot. But motivational talks have no role in therapy rooms. And if there is no collaborative and agreed upon agenda or therapy plan, therapy is a waste of time. As they say, good therapy contract is 50% of therapy. It applies even more to children. Having a very clear collaborative plan with the child, many times writing it down, sending it to the child on email, and having a clear agreed upon co-agenda is something that really makes your therapy absolutely gold. We must also look at why therapy fails. Because therapy does fail. It fails many times than we care to agree on. By most conservative estimate, only 20% children actually continue more than 6 to 7 sessions of therapy. 50% of the times they disappear within 5 to 6 sessions, and at least 20 to 30% of the children will never be seen again after first 2 sessions. This is the reality, and this doesn't say anything about your skills. This is the reality of life. Why does therapy fail? First, there may be no commitment to the therapy process. So therapy process may not be accepted as the required mode in this particular situation, either by the child, by the family, by the society, or sometimes even by the doctor. So check your own commitment to therapy process first before we point fingers to other people. Targets may be too ambitious. Do not let the family set targets for you. Do not let the school set targets for you. If this child does not change this behavior, we will have to expel him from the school is one of the most favorite threat by school. And at such times, it is absolutely okay to tell the school principal, ma'am, it is not my job to show you the letter of law. You are very well within your rights to do whatever you want. You have huge backing from the school management. I'm here to help the child. This is going to take time. The conditions that you are asking for, the preconditions that you are putting there, may be an absolute reality for you as somebody who manages a very complex system called school. I, as doctor, cannot agree with you here. My work is going to take time. If this child had a hand fracture or a leg fracture, you would probably send them home for 3 months, give them all the notes at home, and give them all the help that they need. The child that I am dealing with has a fractured mind. I need 6 months or I need 3 months. Unless we put it in acceptable terms to the teacher, they are not going to accept it. So standing up to the bullying by family and standing up to the bullying by school system is definitely our responsibility, because the child is unable to do it. We have to be their advocates and do it for them so that they can learn assertiveness skills. This is really important. So the extent of change that families expect and the speed with which they expect it may be too ambitious, and then the therapy will be declared as a failure. Inadequate support to the child by family is another important part. Unless this is discussed directly in family sessions, unless this is pointed out, all the fingers will be pointed to the child and in turn at you, and therapy will be declared a failure. Overlooking comorbidities is one of the biggest things. I'm not talking about misdiagnosis here. We all misdiagnose children. It is very easy to misdiagnose children. We always need to revisit our diagnosis after a few sessions, and many times the diagnosis changes. This awareness that conditions are fluid, many times what presents as the primary problem is not the real thing. You come to the real thing only after the primary problem is dealt with, is a daily reality of child psychiatry, and all of us need to be very careful here. In another form, now that litigation is increasing, we have to be very careful about talking about our colleagues' treatment or the previous treatments that the child has received. Particularly if you work in a respectable institution where people go for second, third, fourth, fifth opinion, this is a responsibility for all of us. That if I had seen this child 2 years ago, I think I would have written exactly the same prescription or given the same advice. But now that I have the advantage of additional history of 2 years, seeing how various treatments have worked for this child, I think we need to try something different. So let us try this. This is one of the most useful and professionally ethical statements that I have uttered in my clinic. And this is something that we all need to remember. So looking at comorbidities again, looking at other things that emerge, because treating ADHD is something that everybody wants to do. A lot of people don't see that there is actually an anxiety disorder that goes with this ADHD. There is severe phobia that goes with this ADHD. There may be other neurodevelopmental difficulties that go with this ADHD. There may be a hidden abuse or an abusive traumatic experience for this boy, particularly for boys, that may be triggering this whole thing, which symptomatically looks like ADHD. And many times it takes 7, 8, 10 sessions, sometimes even 2 years to uncover that trauma or for the child to gather that confidence to tell you. I clearly remember one of my early cases where I was trying to treat a child who had serious attentional difficulties. This child was a child of two of my classmates, both of them doctors. And after 2 years of therapy, mother, who was my colleague, was able to tell me that this child was severely sexually abused as a young child, 5 and 6 years old. And that is when the entire course of the therapy changed. So was I wrong for 2 years? Maybe I was wrong for the 2 years. But it took them that much time to actually come up with this kind of information. So we have to be ready for all of this. That is all that I want to discuss with you today. Let me just quickly reiterate the stuff that we saw today, which is what therapy you choose does not matter as long as it contains these three components, where we have to help the child deal with their internal realities. We have to help them modify behaviors and help them modify the environment. Managing mind, the most important component is modifying their negative cognitions using whatever therapy that you are trained with or you feel comfortable with at that point of time. Managing behavior should be simple. It should have small steps. Aim for early success and try to stop harmful behaviors before you start introducing coping strategies and start behavior. Managing environment, de-escalation, helping them contain child's emotion, and encouraging coping behavior in the family with very, very specific instruction goes a long way. Step out of the clinic, walk a street with the child. Children feel much more comfortable when you are talking to them on the street or on the playground or in their own room than what they do in the clinic. This really works. Particularly desensitization in ERP is always something that should be done at the home, at the scene of the crime. Okay, and that is how it works. Therapy can fail. Check for these things periodically if they are emerging or they are likely to fail your therapy thing. And I'm sure you'll be very happy as a child psychiatrist who's using therapy as their primary mode of treatment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shukla. As we have always been doing, today also we'll have a short break in between before we move on to the question answer session. Meanwhile, I'll request all the participants to keep posting their questions in the chat box so that after the break, we can take up one question at a time. And we have the learned speaker with us today morning and his valuable time to answer all our queries with regards to the child psychiatry therapies that we have. Thank you so much. We'll have a short break for 15 minutes. So we'll rejoin around 11 o'clock in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. So, sir, should I log off right now and come back after 15 minutes?
You can mute yourself if you wish and continue to log on.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, fine.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Ma'am, please unmute yourself. I have muted everybody.
Okay. I unmute.
I have muted everybody, Parag sir. You can unmute yourself. Sorry, is unmute.
Parag sir, start the session. We
Sure.
have good number of questions.
Yeah. Dr. Bhushan, can we begin with the question answers?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
So, sir, how do you want me to do it? Should I start answering questions one by
Yeah,
one, or you want to choose
I
them?
can ask the questions
Yeah, great.
one by one
Yeah.
as posted in the chat box. Yeah. So we have Dr. Shilpa Telgod asking a 14 years old girl with hyperactivity, never treated, academics above average, now complains of laziness, inattention and low mood. How to modify the behavior?
So we will. Yeah, can you hear me right now?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. So I think we'll have to look at the developmental pattern of ADHD in a girl here. By the natural progress of this neurodevelopmental disorder, we are going to see more lethargy, more inattentiveness taking center stage, and hyperactivity and probably even impulsivity taking a backstage as she's growing up. So educating family about that would be obviously the first part, and education remains a cornerstone of any psychotherapy in India or anywhere in the world. I would definitely work on self-esteem here. Because what we see is that by the time they reach adolescence, hyperactive children or children with any behavioral difficulty have accumulated a huge amount of negative feedback from literally every day of their life. And many times they do imbibe that feedback or get in a more reaction formation kind of mood. So it is better to work with the child in a more exploratory manner. I wouldn't take pure behavioral approach here, though that is what parents would want. Helping the child to become more aware of their emotions, appreciate the negative cognitions that they have and work on that, and then work on specifically what is called as behavioral activation now. Helping them do more positive specific things in the day starting in a small way can gradually build up that assertiveness and positive self-image as well. That would be my approach in this particular case from the information I have here.
Okay. Thank you. Next question comes from Dr. Menal Joshi. Can you please name the authors of the books for DBT?
Okay, I think somebody already answered that question. Marsha Linehan is the inventor of DBT, and she has wonderful books. Most of them are, I think, available as PDFs and floating around on all the WhatsApp groups and Telegram groups now.
Okay. We have another question coming from Dr. Vivek Kirpekar, sir. Is behavioral therapy given to parents or children? Which works better, parent-centric approach or child-centric approach?
Sir, I would decide that entirely on each case and each component, because there are very clear situations where we know that unless parents modify their behavior, nothing is going to change, or that is the fundamental problem. That is where I would focus on parent session. Sometimes I would enroll a parent as co-therapist, particularly when we are dealing with attachment issues, with anxiety disorders, with OCD. Then parent as a co-therapist will be hugely helpful. In internalization disorders, or when the child does not want the parents to be involved there and want to take control of their behavior, have excellent insight and willingness to participate in the therapy, then I would work only with the child. But I'm open to all three combinations in every case, practically in every session. But there would be a behavior contract or a therapy contract with the child before that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I just ask a supplementary question?
Yes, sir.
Please.
Many a times we see a child present behavioral problems, but the real issue is adjustment problems with parents. In such a situation, you tell to a child, managing parents is okay, but then we need to talk to the child as well.
So I agree with you, sir, that particularly in relationship issues, irrational expectations work from both sides. And many children, particularly urban children nowadays, who have been subject to more permissive parenting initially, have sometimes absolutely unrealistic expectations from their parents, which no parent will ever agree on, or it's not even fair to expect that. It may be about money, it may be about behavior, it may be about various freedoms that they expect, or they expect the deviant behaviors to be tolerated. I think getting the child to see a parent's point of view without alienating the child is a strategy that I would use there. But again, not alienating the child would definitely be the core issue there. So that would be a fairly long process. And at the same time, I would work with parents to reduce their negativity or their fight back or their pushback to the child, so that day-to-day crisis would be averted.
Okay. We move on to the next question by Dr. Sneha Mehta. She wants to know if you can give an example of stop behavior from your recent child patient.
Yeah. So I use stop behavior as the first strategy in most of the cases. When we try to identify what is the dysfunctional behavior that the child is doing, and try to see many times children come up with specific behaviors only in specific situations or with a specific person. It is quite helpful to identify that first. For example, a child who's doing online school, but is spending most of the time on the phone, the screen put to mute for school and chatting with friends, or actually taking a big blanket over their head and going off to sleep, is one of the typical complaints that we see now. So a simple stop behavior there would be actually changing the situation of the child, changing the geographical location of the child at home, and moving them to a dining room, or asking one of the grandparents to sit there with the child and keep an eye on them. When the child agrees, actually putting the phone away, where the child will have to get up from their place and walk up 20 steps before they can unlock the phone and take it back. So simple obstructions put in the bad behavior can help very well stop certain small behavior. Obviously, you need the child to be totally sold out to therapy at this point of time. This is something that helps. Another stop behavior that can help there is children who have a habit of self-harming. So at such times, actually giving them alternatives of what they can do there, or asking the child to swipe the room every day or every evening like a CBI officer and take away harmful objects and hand them over to the mother, where they are committing that I want to be responsible for my own, what you say, well-being, are the kind of stop behaviors that help.
Sir, thank you so much for answering. Can I ask you one more question?
Yeah,
Yes,
please.
ma'am.
Sir, I want to ask, like, with the adults, it's easy to understand whether they are motivated enough to go through the therapy or they want to do the assignments or whatever it is. How it is different for a children to realize whether they are motivated or just they are been in the therapy because the school has told them or because the parents just want.
So I think you have asked probably one of the most elegant questions in this workshop, because I entirely agree with you. And we talked about that right in the beginning, that because children do not have autonomy and many times they are coerced into therapy by other people. So typically during first consultation, we do get an idea of how the child has reached you and how much the child is willing to participate or what is their attitude. We know that with their body language, with their initial talk and everything. So I insist on a one-on-one session with the child and put that out very clearly, that I can see that you have been forced into this therapy, right? And I can also see that you don't have a way out of here just now. So let us put away the agenda that your school or your parents have. What is your agenda? Can you and I have a common agenda together here? Can we work on something together? Assuring them confidentiality, assuring them help, but showing them willingness to put their agenda ahead of everyone else can often win their confidence and get us started in the therapy. Making it very clear to the child that school and family has put this huge burden on me to change this behavior. I am not willing to be the Galli ka Gunda who takes supari and changes things for school and children, even though they are school and parents, even though they are paying me. I'm happy to be your collaborator here if we have a reasonable common agenda together. So putting that up front, open on the table helps.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.
Okay. We have another question coming from Dr. Madhumita. Especially for cases whereby, as a child psychiatrist, you may need to contact the school. So do we ask the child before contacting the school authorities?
So I always talk to the child and the parents before contacting the school. I often take a separate session with the child to understand their reservations about contacting the school and helping them understand the necessity of that. Most of the times I try to copy them in on the email or actually hand over that piece of paper to the child to give it in the school. Because communicating behind child's back, unless you are talking about some very serious safety issues there, which are not so common in our culture, fortunately, that doesn't help. So having child on your side always works. It takes a little bit longer, and maybe the school may not be entirely happy with you, but that's the way it will have to work.
Okay. We have Dr. Evelyn requesting for your email ID in case if any of the participants wants to get back to you with any of the individual queries.
Sure. I'm happy to. I'll just type that email ID here.
So you can post it in the chat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. There I have posted.
Okay. We have a question from Dr. Tanu. Can you share some insight for managing low self-esteem in children?
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Shall I repeat?
No, sir. I heard that it's about self-esteem.
Yeah.
So handling self-esteem in adults and children are two totally different ball games. Child self-esteem often works on what they are able to do in the school or in a specific environment. They want that control on behavior. So many times behavior therapy is a large component of child self-esteem work, helping them appear at more places in the way that they want, helping them practice those dialogues or those sentences, doing role plays with them plays a big role in self-esteem. Then we have another category of children where current, past, or ongoing abuse, particularly emotional abuse, has contributed a lot to their lack of self-esteem. So working on that, working on what goes on at the back of their mind in certain situations, and are there negative cognitions at work there, and how we can modify them and do appropriate behavior helps. A lot of children love this idea that they have to act. With younger children, I typically use their favorite superhero examples. With older children, I use their screen role models or idols. That if you had to act like this person, if this person was in your role, how would they behave in this particular situation? How would they stand? How would be their eye contact? How would be the tone of their voice? And getting them to practice that behavior in clinic room helps them actually do those behaviors, and that kind of starts that induction motor. That behavior gets them positive feedback, that makes them feel better about them, and then they go out and do even more things. So addressing their avoidance pattern and helping them avoid the avoidance patterns is something that contributes greatly to self-esteem there.
Okay. We have another question from Dr. Swati. So can you please tell us what is the line of treatment to handle sibling rivalry?
Okay. So unless there is real physical animosity between children, I would do sibling rivalry work mainly with parents. Here, I would try to avoid children in the therapy room altogether, because then it becomes like an archaeological hunt. Who did what and who did what before what? And it doesn't reach anywhere. One of the strategies that I use is helping parents accept sibling rivalry. One of the most fundamental parts of human growth, psychological development, is having a sibling who you hate and the desire for that sibling to be not there. That is a perfectly normal developmental pattern, and parents need to give up this idea that all children are going to be like Ram, Lakshman, Bharat, Shatrughna and be with each other all the time. Many times it requires modification from that. A realistic appreciation of how parents handle this conflict. Do they habitually or out of force of emotion favor one child over other? Many times, if the difference between the children is less than 5 years, it is better to treat them as equals. A younger child should always get a little less rope of a margin of error there. They have to fall into line much earlier than the older sibling. This is something that is important. Gender inequalities need to be addressed there as well, because many times these are subtle issues which are not brought up. So when you see such issues, then bringing both children and parent together in the session and doing a formal family therapy session can help. But most of the work will have to be with parents on giving appropriate response and ignoring lot of sibling rivalry. Their desire, excessive desire to have everybody be absolutely nice to each other is many times completely irrational.
Another question comes from Dr. Gurvinder Pal Singh. Can you throw some light on brief intervention for harm reduction of alcohol abuse in school children?
I'm a little bit out of my depth here, ma'am, because I haven't done a lot of work with alcohol abuse in India. So I am sorry, but I won't be able to answer your question properly. I have done work with alcohol and drug related issues in UK, but that reality is totally different and support structure is totally different. So I'm really sorry, but I don't have any authoritative or sensible answer for your question. That's not my area of work at all.
Okay. We have a question from Dr. Ram Malika Khani. Do you recommend house tree person projective drawing to children and requesting him to narrate or a story on the child has drawn? Projective techniques.
Yeah. So I use play therapy and projective techniques quite extensively. In fact, my clinic room is a play therapy room with 2 sofas where parents and the child can sit. So it is not a traditional consulting room at all. I work in a play therapy room. That's my primary room. I use art extensively. Though formally, I do not use a house tree person anymore because I have a very well qualified child psychologist doing assessments for me, and she does an excellent job. But I do use that for ice breaking. the recent book that I have published with Bindu Madhav Khire about sex, sexuality,
And
gender
music.
roles, and sexual minorities, I have described a lot of extensive work with house tree person, drawings, and play therapy there. So I use that all the time. I also use a story building technique. So I use uh, Howard Gardner's lateral story building, where I talk about the emotions and the sub layers of the story, and the child gives direction to the story. So mutual story building technique is something that I use for very young children. I have a bunch of dice. So these are typical dice that you use while playing Ludo or something like that, but they are big ones. They are almost this big dice, and they have symbols and pictures on them. So we throw the bunch of dice and the child picks up the symbols and starts making a story from those symbols. So I use that kind of story building with children.
We have a question from Dr. Komal. How can we as psychiatrists can help parents of hyperactive, inattentive child at the clinic without a psychologist at our help?
I agree that this is one of the most difficult situations for a parent where and for a psychiatrist, where the child is obviously troubled, it is causing a lot of problem, and we do not have sufficient resources there. In initial days of practice, before I could form a team for almost 4 to 5 years, I used to work in a group therapy setting, because honestly, doing the same thing with 20 parents in a day is emotionally and physically quite exhausting, and their need is very much there. So I get them in a group therapy setting where I lead a parents group and do the problem solving together for them. These sessions can be fairly long, like 2-hour session, but then I do the behavior modification therapy work with 7 or 8 parents getting there together in the group. It works out better financially as well, so that you can have more frequent sessions. Parents don't feel burdened and you don't feel like you are doing excessive amount of charity. So group work often helps there. And my strategy for that group work first is to reduce the friction in the family, helping parents choose target behaviors very carefully, take on only one target behavior at a time, modify that, and only then move on to next target behavior. Parents often get hyper ambitious in behavior therapy and want to change a lot of things. So helping them develop a behavior therapy program which is really graded. So right in the beginning, the contract is for 10 months to 1 year. So telling them that it is going to take that much time and then gradually modifying the behavior patterns. That is how I go about it.
Thank you, sir.
We have a question from Dr. Cheryl. Can you enlighten us on how to set up a child-friendly psychiatry OPD?
Okay, so I work in 2 OPDs, 3 OPDs actually. One setup is exclusively child therapy setup, child psychiatry setup, where right from the waiting room to my clinic room, it is fairly informal. That makes it a lot easy. Second setup is where I share the facility with the adult psychiatrists. So again, we use different rooms, and my room is set up as a play therapy unit. And the third setup is a medical college setup, which is a regular OPD, which is a table, 2 chairs on both sides, and that's all, which is, I would say, the most unfavorable setup. My take is that if you are working from your own clinic, then converting at least a corner of that clinic into a proper play therapy setup, where you have a large, sturdy dollhouse, all the toys inside, where you can sit on the floor or have appropriate chairs for the child and talk to the child by sitting down on the floor on big cushions or without a table. That is something that really helps.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We have a question from Dr. Ravikant Tangela. How to handle very aggressive teenager who would be hell-bent to get his demands fulfilled and not ready to engage in any kind of therapy? Can the parents complain formally to police if he repeatedly and gets physically aggressive if they don't accept his demands? Is it a practical solution?
Sir, thank you for asking this question, because now we see such children with increasing frequency. We typically see children anywhere between age of 12 to 18 who are physically extremely aggressive, who are abusive, who have done horrible things to their parents, and parents literally live in fear. So I've been working in this same city as a psychiatrist for close to 22 years. So I have developed relationship with police stations over a period of time. Many times police inspectors, or now that you have women and child cells there, so usually you have a female police sub-inspector at every police station. If we have already interacted with them, are more than happy to visit the family, talk to the child, or in an emergency, bring the child over to police station without any formal paperwork and actually admonish them and stand up there and help the parents feel safe. So it is perfectly legitimate to get police help in such situation. My experience so far, at least in Pune, has been very positive with police force.
Thank you. We have Dr. Sungniani asking if you can recommend some good books for child psychotherapy.
Now that's a real difficult one to answer, to be very honest. Most of the child therapy books that I have used are behavior therapy books, CBT books from the Beck Institute, and Marshall Linehan's books, and modified them for children. As they say about children's literature, it is just like adults' literature, but a lot better. So what modifies there by way of techniques is really the more simple language and the smaller tasks. That is what I have done. So most of my initial training has been with adult therapy, so I continue to use those books.
Okay. We have a question from Dr. Evelyn. How do we deal with a child who feels that she's not loved while parents give proofs that they really love the child and are willing to do anything for the child?
Okay, so I'm going to go out on a limb and hazard a guess here. I think what is being presented in the therapy session or in the clinic may be different from the emotional reality of both the parties. Behaviorally, something must be happening, but emotionally, something else is happening altogether. I would definitely have an exploratory session with this child, a few sessions of what is their idea of love. How would they see parents love? What are the role models in front of them? What are the other examples that are there? And can we get these parents and this child in the same room, on the same table, and actually discuss their idea of love? Because parents may be very caring and the child may be looking at something else by way of love altogether. They may be looking for more acceptance. The children may be looking for more leeway. They may be looking for more pampering. Some children may be even looking for more firm discipline from parents as a way to get help. So all these options would be open. I would definitely explore the idea of love with this child as it is seen from their point of view.
We have a question from Dr. Sona. How does one differentiate if the child is really participating in the behavioral therapy or just complying to an adult in authority?
Sorry, sir, can you please repeat that question? I lost in between.
So this is with regards to a dilemma that a therapist can have for a child in therapy. How does one differentiate if the child is really participating in the behavioral therapy sessions or just complying to an adult who is in an authority, can be a doctor or a parent?
Yeah. Obviously the way child behaves in the therapy session is obviously very important parameter. For evocative questions, are they willing to give detailed answers? How is their attitude towards homework or actual participation in therapy? So we are doing a lot of role plays there. How enthusiastically does the child participate in that? Are they able to follow through homework tasks? Are they asking for help? That is something that is quite important. That will give me a lot of clues towards whether it is a voluntary participation or it is a forcing. Many times children are initially brought forcibly, but they warm up to the idea of therapy. They realize that they can actually get help and then they start participating. So that process is very much possible. So I think Dr. Ajit Bhide has offered to suggest books. Sir, that would be most welcome. Please suggest books.
First, Bhushan, I think that was a fantastic presentation to compress so much with such feeling and personal touch within an hour.
Thank you, sir.
Hats off to you for that.
Thank you, sir.
The two books which linger with me, they are a little dated, but they are fantastic books. One of them is actually for the lay public. It is not only for therapists, but I think therapists can also benefit from reading it. Is Wayne Dyer's book, What do you really want for your child? That is the title of the book. Or is it for your children? I'm not sure. What do you really want for your child? That's a positive psychology outlook book. The other book for really troubled children, more directed towards professionals, but intelligent parents can also read it, is good old Michael Rutter's Helping Troubled Children. I don't think that book has been bettered. Unfortunately, it's a little dated. So Michael Rutter has not been active for the last 15 years plus, but that book is really worth possessing and using, Helping Troubled Children.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I started with Virginia Axeline because I was initially trained in person-centered therapy, and I took up natural to play therapy after that. So play therapy and Dibs in Search of Self is where I cut my teeth on. So
those books are remarkable, but they are much more focused on the severely internalized disturbances.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. We have Dr. Prerna asking, at times we get children with impulse discontrol and behavioral issues, and often discover that the parents themselves have similar problems. How do we negate around this situation?
So this is something that is probably a very unique situation for child psychiatry. This we don't get to see so much in adult psychiatry, that whenever we are dealing with neurodevelopmental issues, and a lot of child problems have clear neurodevelopmental implications, there you have significant heritability. So in the initial assessment phase itself, I do ask about what are the family patterns, how are the parents' behaviors, have they faced similar difficulties as children, is there any particular family member that this child reminds them of, do they have fears that the child will actually turn out like that? And if we feel that it is, I have also faced situations where both the parents had impulse control difficulty and the child as well. So we actually agreed that, let's form a group of 3 of you, and you're going to help each other get over these difficult situations. So getting parents as co-therapists, getting parents as even co-patients is something that can help in such situations. It takes away the alienation. Parents also feel content that they wish they had that help 20 years ago, so they are desperate to give that help to their child to avoid similar predicament. So getting all of them into a similar life narrative really helps in such situations.
Thank you, sir. So actually, my question was, children with intellectual disability, when they come, we often realize that even the parents have intellectual deficits and they're not able to understand inputs of behavioral therapy. So how do we navigate around that?
That would be an extremely difficult situation. I have been in such situations, fortunately not very often, where I try to enroll either the other parent or sometimes the grandparent, because now we have a situation, particularly here in Pune and Mumbai, where people with a mild intellectual disability or borderline intelligence have been very well supported. Their parents have even got them married to similar people, but unfortunately, appropriate contraception advice was not given, and now they are parents. So at such times, adding in a family member, sometimes a grandparent, sometimes getting specific help from school can really help. Because if parents are low on that particular area of resource, then it becomes really difficult with them. So getting another person, adult, an intellectually better enabled adult in the picture can really help.
Thank you, sir.
Unfortunately, there is no simple answer to this question. This is a very, very tricky situation.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. With the permission of the speaker and the chair, I think, shall we continue with the further questions? We have a couple of them more.
Sir,
I must ask
perfectly
the
okay.
speaker who must not be exhausted.
Sir, I'm okay for a few minutes more. No problem at all.
Okay, fine. Thank you. How do we deal with over-involved parents or the so-called helicopter parenting?
Yeah, that is something that we see with increasing frequency now, isn't it? I think this is something where empathy that I talked about in family work really works, because over-involved parents invariably have their own ideas about how a child should be brought out. These are very sensitive people who are very tuned to child's needs and most of the times demands as well. So are they being permissive or are they being over involved? What are their own experiences of attachment? So I'm a big fan of attachment work, and I use that quite extensively in my clinical work. So getting parents to talk about their childhood, their experience of being parented, and what all issues that they saw there. Many times parents make this commitment to themselves that when I grow up, when I have my children, this is not how I'm going to behave, or this is how I'm going to behave. And if they find a similar partner, then this can really multiply multifold. So laying open that narrative of their own life can help in such situations a lot.
We have a question from Dr. Kumar Kamble. Please share your experiences on managing the two different scenarios. One is a child with suicidal thoughts, whereby the child expresses to you, but the parents have no idea. And the second scenario, the child expresses the use of substances to you, and the parents don't know about it.
Yeah. So yes, the substance abuse is not that common yet, but I think we are getting there. We are definitely moving in that direction. And suicidal thoughts, even plans, are unfortunately getting increasingly common in clinical practice. So my rule of thumb there is to do a detailed risk assessment with the child. And once I have completed my risk assessment, sharing it with the child, that whether you belong to the low risk category, middle risk category, or high risk category, and what would be the appropriate step at that point of time, trying to develop a clear preventative plan with the child, and also discussing with them their fear of sharing it with parents. That what do they think will be the implications of sharing this with their parent? Is it possible to address their concerns and still have parents empathically involved? Because here not only we are getting into a complex medical legal issue, but a complex ethical issue as well. So if the risk is low, if the substance abuse is of low grade or not of a substance that is immediately dangerous to the child, like heroin or LSD, then I would try 1 or 2 sessions to develop better self-control in the child and see if it is working, but all the time be ready to bring in parents if that is really necessary. Many times I ask the child that, and if there are insurmountable differences, immediately insurmountable differences between parent and child, to name other trusted adult that can be brought into the therapy. Sometimes that works as well.
Okay. We have scenarios coming up from the participants. One similar one that when the parents too have a lot of psychopathologies, something like there are children 3 years and 8 years old fighting all the time in the house, having a lot of behavioral issues. And at the same time, we have the mother who is contemplating suicide or having issues with the family, in-laws, and a lot of psychosocial factors playing role in the family. How do we approach such kind of scenarios?
So my take in complex situations where there are multiple factors, many of them are not immediately modifiable or not modifiable at all, is to stick to basics and actually assure safety first. So trying to find out a key person, a decision maker, or an able person in the family. Many times they may not have a lot of power, but just their presence, an alternative attachment figure for the child, may be very helpful. Identifying the key adult psychopathology and getting them help for that can also work. I remember in the initial days of my work, we did an extensive study of hyperactive children with specific aim of finding out carryover of postpartum maternal depression. And we realized that there were quite a few cases where identifying mother's depression and giving her help with that depression actually made the hyperactivity disappear in the child. So it was not hyperactivity at all. It was just hyperactivity by DSM criteria. In reality, that was the emotional distress in the child. That is what we were looking at. So sticking to basics, looking at safety, trying to recruit another family member who can safeguard or be an attachment figure for the child. Many times in my clinic, I have advised them to seriously consider residential care for these children, residential schools for these children. And that may come as a relief to the family. Many times they have thought about similar arrangement themselves, but feel too guilty to do it. So giving them that prestige suggestion that given your present family situation, it is perfectly fine to send children to residential schools to reduce the burden of care on you immediately, then gradually regroup, and over a period of 2 to 3 years trying to get back the family together again is a perfectly valid alternative even in our country.
Okay. We have a question from Dr. Shruti that often in adolescents in therapies, they give a routine feedback that they are doing well, and many a times the therapist is misled that the therapy is going well in the right direction, while cross inquiry with the parents many a times reveals that the problematic behavior of the adolescent is still persisting. So what would be the correct order of holding individual sessions with the child versus the parent during the therapy sessions?
So if we have time, I would like to give a slightly detailed answer of this question. One thing that I learned early on is that how I emotionally react to the therapy situation of a particular child is very important. I'm deliberately not using the word counter-transference here. Because I think that is a much abused word. It should be strictly used only in terms of analytical therapy, because it's a complex issue altogether, and it has got a lot to do with a lot of help can be received in supervision for that. So I'm not using countertransference. I'm simply talking about biases. How are my biases playing into this therapy? Do they make me blind to certain aspects of this child? Do they make me go out on a limb and take child's side against the parents in this situation? Am I being actually recruited by this child? So this comes from my training in systemic family therapy. That is the child trying to recruit me here, or is anybody trying to recruit me here, is an important question that I would ask myself and safeguard against that. In spite of all of this, it is not unusual to realize that what is happening in therapy is completely different from what is happening in reality. In such situations, a periodic parental review or a periodic joint session, so every 4th or 5th session would be a periodic session. To give you an example from completely wrong field, which is from the battlefield, is many times machine guns have a tracer bullet, that every 6th bullet or a 7th bullet is a lighted bullet, which actually tells you where your bullets are going. So using that kind of thing, a periodic sum up session or a overview session with family can be really helpful. And the teenager also gets a clear message that you can't be fooled, you can't be recruited like that, you can't be taken for ride. If that is a repetitive pattern, I would often use that as reflections with the child, that what is happening in therapy, how you feel here and how you feel outside seem to be two very different things. Is there anything that we can do to bridge this gap? Can we look at why this is happening? Can we change this? So taking it towards reflections and a therapy agenda can also be a very useful strategy there.
Thank you very much, sir. That answers my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have Dr. Jaya asking if you can throw some light on use of art in your therapy sessions. How do you do it and how people can use it?
So art definitely has a big role. As a psychiatrist, I would definitely be cautious here, because in India, we have a tendency to declare anything as therapy. As I call it, that Jadoo ki Jhappi therapy after Munna Bhai MBBS was a big thing that was almost happening there. So being careful of, are we using art as a therapeutic way of expressing ourselves? Or are we using art as actually a therapy method? Is something that one has to ask oneself. I do not have training in art therapy, though I have worked with a few art therapists who are extremely able and work in schools. So I'm absolutely open to the idea. But we will have to have the boundaries and the targets very clearly delineated with this therapy. I have not come across situations where using only art was complete therapy for a particular child, though it has been adjunct in many therapies.
Okay. We have Dr. Shweta asking about certain difficult situations when you are dealing with a child in a therapy and there are confidentiality issues. that probably can be a kind of an ethical dilemma for the therapist, revealing, not revealing to parents, how much respecting child's wishes, how much.
Okay, so here the situation is slightly complex for psychiatrists because of the legal implications. As you know that in India, the current law does not give any consenting authority to a child till 18 years of age. Though we talk about assent of the child from 12 years onwards for all procedures, the consent is still a parental consent. So safety would be a huge issue here. If the child is talking about something that has happened in distant past, there is no immediate danger of that continuing, and it is an issue that the child wants to deal with in their mind so that they can be a better able human being, more confident or less symptomatic, then I would not take it to parents immediately. But if the risk assessment shows that child is in current and present danger, and except parents nobody can really help the child, then I would clearly tell the child that here is my legal responsibility to break that confidentiality and talk to parents. Particularly in cases of sexual abuse, this becomes very complicated because current Indian law, POCSO, has put us in a very tight spot. We all know that informing police immediately is one of the worst things to do in child abuse situations. Particularly because I know this because I've been working in this field for almost 20 years now, but a current law has really made our position completely untenable, particularly for a standalone psychiatrist who does not have protection of an institution. You know, being in a medical college or being in big institutes where there is a hierarchy, where the police commissioner and your director probably share a drink in the evening and can talk to each other, is not available to each and every private psychiatrist. So I would put your own interest, particularly in legal safety, first before you decide to go out and help the child. This may sound extremely selfish, but that is how things have turned out in many urban centers for standalone psychiatrists now.
We can have this as the last question for today, and it comes from Dr. Bide sir. Sexual precocity seems more common in the past decades. Any comments regarding the incidence and management?
So this is getting to be a horrible hot potato for child psychiatrists all over the country, I think, and you have already experienced a lot of this stuff. The age of consent and everything still remains 18 in India. And as we know, everything else is available for children from the age of 3 years onwards. So my take here is I'm not taking a moral stand in therapy when I'm working with a child one-on-one, particularly when I do not see an immediate danger to the child. So working on child's side, helping them improve their risk assessment strategy and appropriate behaviors is what I do now. But yes, there have been multiple times when I have erred on the side of caution and involved the parents, and I tried to safeguard the child. Many times the child has hated me for it, but that is how it is at present. It is a kind of perfect problem. There is no perfect solution for it as yet.
Okay. I have one question from my side. You have been practicing for last 20 years and have seen different stages and times. Are you experiencing a lot of flux in the way the normative norms for considering normal behaviors in children or the thought processes in children may be changing with time, especially in last 1 decade, considering the influence of so many factors like the information technology, the family life systems, the relationships, the parenting styles, and the change in the society in general. As a child psychiatrist, when you try to work with children, does the reference point changes with time?
Yeah, I think it has changed in a huge way. When I started my practice, my first child was not yet born. And today she is a 20-year-old third-year law student. And my younger one is appearing for her 10th. So it is literally, we have been through generations. Initially, it was easy to communicate with children because I was communicating with my daughters, and obviously that helped. Life experience helps as a child psychiatrist. But now one has to make an effort to connect with parents of very young children, because they themselves belong to a very different age group. Social norms, as we discussed, have definitely changed and they continue to evolve. But the difficulty here remains, and I think this is a very typical Indian difficulty, that we exist at multiple levels even within the same person. You know, we are at one end, our mind is still anchored in 2005-year-old cultural paradigms. And on the other hand, our children are talking about Elon Musk and Justin Bieber and whatnot things that are happening there. So different parts of our existence, different parts of our mental life actually exist in different centuries. And this is one of the most difficult problems that we will have to solve as a generation of psychiatrists and as for ourselves as well. And again, I think senior practitioners are seniors who have seen the 30 years, 40 years of transition, particularly people who were already in active practice before the economic opening up of 1991, and people who are still practicing now will have to guide us on how to handle these transitions and how to go about it. I have no perfect answer for that. I keep struggling with it on every day. My only strategy against it is that I use empathy and reflections as my best tools, that whenever I'm in that dilemma, I reflect that dilemma, I share that dilemma with the child or with the parent, get their feedback on that, and then we aim to move ahead together in it.
Thank you so much for your reply. And I think if we have some more questions from the participants, they can post the same in our psychotherapy WhatsApp groups. So we'll be adding people who are already not there in the WhatsApp groups today. And in case if you have anything related to today's topic, and if you want to reach to the speaker, we can help. Please post any of your queries in our WhatsApp group anytime today, and we'll get back to you. With this note, on behalf of IPS Psychotherapy Subcommittee, I take the pleasure to thank the speaker for today's session, Dr. Bhushan Shukla. It was a wonderful time we all had, and I think wonderful audience, lots and lots of question answers, some of them still unanswered. Very, very unmet area of learning that probably today we had the first session, and we are looking forward to have many more meaningful conversations in future. Thank you, sir, for sparing your time with us. I'll request Dr. Sona Kakkar to give the concluding thankful remarks.
Thank you, Dr. Paraksha. Thank you, Dr. Bhushan Shukla. Such an enlightening talk and lots of experience and so much study that you have shared with us. And of course, there's so much more. I'm sure like the questions aren't ending, and we are very keen to know more and more because it's a unique area that you've picked up, a challenging area that you've picked up and worked consistently over so many years. And this is really beneficial to us to hear whatever you have shared today. Thank you so much for joining us, and we do hope to have you again because it's been such a wonderful talk. And thank you all the participants. Thank you, Dr. Vivek. Thank you, Dr. Parag. Again, sparing time on Sunday and just joining us all, and we're all just trying to build our sensibilities around psychotherapy, which is still fledgling, new in India. And thanks to Dr. Bhushan Shukla and our some of even maybe participants here, we hope to continue our journey into advancing psychotherapy and psychotherapy and practice in India through Psychotherapy Subcommittee. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Bhushan. You're part of our group. I'm sure the questions are going to continue. We're waiting to hear from you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for this opportunity. Thanks everybody from IPS. And thank you all the participants. This is really encouraging. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Have a nice Sunday.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Okay, Dr. Kakkar, can I leave the meeting? How does it work?
Yes, Dr. Bhushan, you can leave. Join the group. Possibly you'll have to spend a few more minutes.
Yeah, no problem at all. No problem at all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye. Bye, Dr. Bede. Bye, Dr. Kakkar.
Ma'am, you can end the meeting. I cannot end it
Okay.
because now I'm not
Okay.
the host.
Okay. Thank you, Tushar.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. We are taking a break in October. We'll come back in November. So you can have a nice Diwali break too.
Fine. Thank you, ma'am. Bye.
Rest is important.